Welcome to the Veritas podcast. I'm Scott Veritas, and today I'm joined by journalist and podcaster Katie Herzog. Katie, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's great to have you on. I've been very excited to talk to you. You on your show, Blocked and Reported, which is great, by the way, and I recommend it to everyone listening. It's the show Katie does with Jesse Single. You talk about a lot of the things that I'm interested in, and you do that in general in your reporting and everything. So I've been very excited to talk to you, and I want to start off by just asking you, for people who maybe aren't as familiar, if you could just talk about who you are and particularly how you became somewhat of a kind of controversial figure in the wonderful world of online political discourse and in certain sections.
Yeah. Well, so as you mentioned, I'm a journalist, and I think my reputation as controversial really started in 2017 after I wrote an article for The Stranger, which is Seattle's alt weekly about detransitioners, and that was well received in some quarters and very poorly received in others, and there was a lot of backlash both offline and offline about that piece, and that was really sort of the beginning of my of growing a reputation for being controversial. And I think what also contributes to that is I have some opinions that I think are totally normal and actually probably are very moderate opinions in the, if you look at sort of the big scheme of American politics. But things like I wrote, like during the Me Too movement, I wrote about things like the need for due process. I don't think that should have been particularly controversial, but it was among some commentators and readers. So things like that. I think my reporting on trans stuff in particular is really the thing that has pegged me with this. But there's an array of opinions that I frequently express that have garnered me this label, even though I think that my politics are probably more to the left than the average American for sure, but also just like pretty moderate.
Yeah, I mean, it would seem to me from what I know about you, Katie, that you've just unapologetically talked about and reported on things in a way that wouldn't really bother the vast majority of people the way that I think of it. It always kind of shocks me when I think about particularly the shift that has occurred on a lot of the issues related to like the trans stuff, gender ideology, just over the course of like a 5-year period. Because it seemed like if you talked about some of the things you talked about in like 2013. Like I think about the year 2013 and I think about it going to like 2018. So I think about it in terms of in 2013, most people would have found the idea of a man identifying as a woman and then being treated as a woman in any and all circumstances. They would have found that kind of beyond the realm of parody, honestly, and at that time. But then by 2018, Twitter is kicking people off for saying that men can't be women. So there's this huge shift. Have you found in your experience and having had, personal experience seeing the backlash kind of hit you personally, have you been sort of shocked by just the speed at which the discourse has changed on that issue? And also, do you think it reflects a genuine shift in public opinion, or is there something else that's going on there? Because that's the thing that always kind of hits me when I think about this stuff is the speed at which it all seemed to change.
Yeah, it's been really, really rapid. Something like non-binary pronouns, which I think most people a few years ago thought were a joke or were sort of never thought that, the singular they would catch on. And it was really the fringe activist types who were indulging this. And obviously non-binary pronouns are increasingly accepted. I think they was the word of the year in 2019, according to whatever dictionary comes up with that. So yeah, things like, trans women in sports, in female sports. Never, 10 years ago would I have thought, oh yes, this will be a mainstream position in a few short years. And that is what is happening. And I think there are some shifts. You can look at polling on this. Things like there was a poll. Can't remember who was. I can't remember who did the poll, but some big poll, I think last year, asked Democrats, Republicans, different demographics, if they thought that trans women should be able to play in women's sports, and 55% of Democrats. It was a solid minority of all people across all generations, but 55% of Democrats who responded to this said yes, which I think is very high. But I still don't think, it's still a minority position. But that's changing. It's changing quickly. And I think that there will be some backlash to this as well. The Leah Thomas case at Penn, this has become a big national and international story. And I think ultimately that this is bad for trans people. I think that activists have pushed beyond basic human rights, housing, safety, access to medical care, employment, things that I think most people would say trans people, including myself, should have access to and should be treated like everybody else. And in fact, I do think that in sort of regular situations, most situations, trans people should be treated as the sex they identify as. I don't misgender people. I think that it's just polite. You know, I will even if I can acknowledge that a trans woman isn't literally female, I will treat her as a woman. But there are these edge cases where it's not appropriate for trans women to be treated as women, or at least not to be classified as women. Prisons, shelters, things like that, sports. And yeah, this so I think that this is going to cause a backlash, that activists have pushed beyond sort of the basic human rights issues into this weird ideology and this weird rhetoric. Things like trans women are women or trans women are even female is something that you will read. And I think that this backlash is actually going to be bad for trans rights in total. And you can see that in polling as well. Support for things like trans people serving in the military has actually gone down in the last few years. And it's not often when our collective sort of sense of rights and what rights people should have shrinks. Generally, we are moving towards progress, but that's one case in which you can see the backlash. And I think that is the fault primarily of activists who are pushing beyond the basic issues of human rights and pushing for things like trans women in sports.
Yeah, it does feel like there is like a broad consensus underlying the sort of like toxic discourse online where people want to respect the entire LGBT community. I mean, you know, what the shift that we saw with gay marriage at one point has been kind of fascinating to watch, and everything, and just broader acceptance of transgender people as people and trying to be respectful of their identities. But it feels like at times there might have been kind of a slippery slope effect where once there was, I talked to Colin Wright recently on my podcast, and he kind of put it in an interesting way, which is that he felt like he had kind of been had by the people who had said like, oh, you know, just respect my gender identity. It'll never call into question biological sex if you could just use these pronouns. And I also just had Buck Angel on the show, who is somebody who absolutely will double down on that and say he is biologically female and he just wants to be treated as a man for his personal comfort and you know, affirmation. And but it sort of feels like we as a society have failed at this moment, and maybe we can get back to this. We failed to kind of not let a slippery slope take place. Do you think it was possible for us to have not done that, or can we right that ship? What might that look like, you think?
I'm not sure what this would look like. I think we're in a strange moment right now. There's a lot of panic on all across the political spectrum. I also think that part of the reason this is happening is because after the success of gay marriage, activist groups like the Human Rights Campaign and other large activist groups, instead of being like, hey, we did it, we won, you know, with gay marriage, and then after the Supreme Court ruling on Bostock, they didn't shut down, they pivoted. And they pivoted to the next issue, which was trans rights. And you can see this if you look up even the annual reports of a group like HRC, the Human Rights Campaign. Search for the word lesbian and then search for the word trans over time. They really have pivoted away from gay rights and towards trans rights. And so there's a whole, I don't want this to sound conspiratorial, but because it's not, I think it's just sort of an organic form of mission creep. But there are ecosystems, there's infrastructure, there's institutions that are really devoted to pushing for this issue. And how we rate this, I mean, I don't know. and I don't think
it's a hard question to answer.
Yeah, and I don't think it helps when people like Vladimir Putin come out and say, and talk about people like J.K. Rowling. I think that is bad for those of us who do want to see more sense in this world. Yeah, and it's also, I think it's also really true that legislatures, both in blue states and red states, but more so right now in red states, really capitalize on this issue, and they use it as electioneering fodder. They use it as campaigning. I'm really against these bills, like the bills in Florida and in Texas, and bills that legislate. Even though I am opposed to trans women and women's sports, I don't think that this should be something that the state gets involved in. And I think that politicians are using this cynically. I don't think this is something they actually even probably in most cases really think that the state needs to be devoting resources to. But this is a great way to whip up the electorate.
Yeah, it does feel like we have a political leadership class that is almost completely uninterested in like any kind of actual nuance or discourse on these issues.
Right.
And I've had conversations on this show before about how just the term cancel culture has been appropriated by Republican politicians in a nauseating way. And I guess the parody of that is Putin actually appropriating the term cancel culture, which has been kind of hilarious, to be honest. I mean, I cannot believe that he's actually invoking that.
Although I will say, I do think that he has a point. I don't think that the response to him personally or sanctions of Russian industries is actually cancel culture. I do think it's cancel culture when, some federation like the Cat Show Federation bans Russian cats. I think there really is an element, of a very sort of reminiscent of the Red Scare element of what is happening now. Putin is obviously trying to capitalize on this, but I actually do think, not with him in particular, but like when other people who have nothing to do with the Russian state government are penalized based on his actions, I do think that is a form of cancel culture. I just wish he wasn't the one making the fucking point.
I know. There's definitely some truth to that. I think I would tend to agree with you, Katie, that I was hearing about like people are canceling like reservations at Russian restaurants, and I'm like, oh, for the love of God. I mean, like some of this stuff has really been difficult to understand because, there's a whole culture in the United States, civil rights as an idea. I mean, national origin is included in those kind of protected classes. I mean, if we're discriminating, I know it's not de facto discrimination. It's not legal discrimination, obviously, against Russians in the United States right now. We're not like interning them like the Japanese or anything. But there is this social discrimination that it's put you and I in a weird situation where it's like Vladimir Putin kind of has a point. I mean, I know we're not saying that Vladimir Putin is literally this great person who has, who is right about everything, and it doesn't apply to him personally. I mean, he's a man who invaded a frickin' country. But there is this weird thing where people they'll take an important conversation, whether it's over cancel culture or over gender ideology, and they'll politicize it to a point where it just becomes they sort of treat it like it's like a sports match, and they're like, well, I can just kind of score some points here. And it's very, very frustrating because for someone like me personally, I have kind of written off the Democratic Party's ability to deal with a lot of these issues because I just feel like they are completely beholden to this activist class. And the Republican Party, I kind of look at them as like, and I'm personally an independent. I don't actually affiliate with either, but I kind of look at the Republican Party as like, maybe we can do something to deal with some of these issues that I care about. And then I see them electioneering on it in a way that is discouraging, to say the least.
They are banning books. They are literally banning books. Like the response to the liberal left has, on the right, and obviously I'm generalizing here, but among people with actual power, has to become even batshit crazier, even more liberal. In response to this, it really, these extremes are feeding off of each other. California or Connecticut or someplace will pass some stupid law mandating that trans women should be allowed to play in women's sports, and then Idaho passes a law banning it. It's tribal. It is a reaction to one side's perceived enemies, and it is not at all what our elected leaders should be focusing on. There's a fucking pandemic. Healthcare is an issue. Infrastructure is an issue. Shit is too expensive, and they're wasting their time on banning books and in legislating these culture war issues that really should not be legislated by the government. These are issues that people need to work out without the government being involved.
Do you think that there's a strong chance that if the government were to take a hands-off approach, if the Republican Party and the Democratic Party in some ways, if they weren't taking these kind of strong-handed approaches to some of these culture war issues, do you think that like the, I don't actually know the exact name, but it's the governing body of like college athletes, college athletics, that those private institutions, is that kind of what you're advocating for, is let that be worked out? Because it's funny because a lot of conservatives would say that's kind of the quote-unquote conservative position, is to let the private sector deal with it.
It's the small government, or it's the libertarian position. Yes, I think that they should be worked out within these institutions. And I certainly have strong opinions about these particular issues. But yeah, I think that the government getting involved just really turns the heat up. And it's really hard to have like if detransition is something that you're concerned about, if you think that, for instance, there needs to be more gatekeeping before minors receive permanent medical interventions, things like puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones, or even surgery, I do think there needs to be more gatekeeping, and we're seeing this in places in Europe where they are making it more difficult for youth to get things like puberty blockers. This shouldn't be legislated by the state. This is something that medical bodies and institutions need to be dealing with on their own, because, and they are not doing a great job. I will fully admit that. These organizations like WPATH is the big one for trans healthcare. They are not, for the most part, they are taking extremist approaches to this. Well, this is changing somewhat in some places. But when the state gets involved in this, there's a natural backlash. So when Texas bans youth transition, California will come up with some law making it even easier for kids to get fucking puberty blockers.
Hey folks, sorry for the awkward transition here. There was a technical glitch during recording that meant Katie and I had to stop recording to work out some tech stuff. Just putting this here so you don't get confused about how the interview proceeds when we restart the recording here. You were talking about kind of the private institutions stepping in to work out a lot of the transgender stuff that is being legislated on the left and right. You were kind of talking about like this arms race between the Democratic and Republican primaries when it comes to the transgender issues. Please feel free to jump in on that at any point. What may end up happening is I may have like an annotation in the video about like broken footage, so feel free to just kind of jump in wherever.
Yeah, I think arms race is a really good way to put it, that a blue state does something and then a red state reacts to it, and vice versa. That said, I do have major concerns about things like the overdiagnosis of gender dysphoria. I think that actually is a problem. And I think that there needs to be more gatekeeping when it comes to youth getting access to things like puberty blockers. And not just because of the potential for false positives, diagnosing someone with gender dysphoria and giving them access to things like puberty blockers and then cross-sex hormones, but also because puberty blockers, people often claim that puberty blockers are reversible. That's not really true. There are all sorts of negative health effects to puberty blockers. And for one thing, if you care about trans kids, you should want to have the best possible outcomes for them. And so something like take sexual function. If you take puberty blockers and then you go on to cross-sex hormones, it is possible that you will never be able to orgasm in your life. This is something that I think people should be concerned about. There are also issues with fertility, with bone density. These are real things. And so there's this irony of activists who sort of repeat these platitudes, protect trans kids. Well, if you want to protect trans kids, you should want them to have access to the best healthcare possible. And sometimes that means waiting until they have more sexual development before they start to transition. And I understand there's a lot of fear mongering about this. Parents will hear that if their kids don't have access to puberty blockers or hormones immediately when they want them right now, they will kill themselves. the data doesn't back this up. There's lots of studies about this. Some of them are very bad studies, of course, but that is a dangerous message to tell people. It is dangerous, and it's deeply dishonest. So I'm deeply concerned about these issues. I think that healthcare for trans youth has gone off the rails, and this opinion is informed by, in part, the work of Erica Anderson, who is a trans clinician who has very bravely come out and written about some of these things, much to the chagrin of some trans activists. But at the same time, I do not think that states should be the ones legislating this issue. I think it really needs to come down to medical organizations figuring out what best practices are, not themselves not being swayed by activists, but really looking at the data, following the science, following the actual science, and making recommendations based on what is going to be best for these kids. But yeah, Greg Abbott stepping in and saying, we're going to make it illegal to give puberty blockers, and then investigate parents who give them to their children and potentially take their children out of their home is so fucked up. So fucked up. And it doesn't help. It doesn't help in the end. It makes everything worse.
Yeah, I think the over-the-top rhetoric that you're referring to, it doesn't help. And I think that it creates a little bit of, it almost feels like there's kind of a prisoner's dilemma situation where each party kind of feels like if they don't jump on the ball, the other team gets it, and that this thing's going to go off the rails. And the thing about that is, I'm curious what your perspective on this is, Katie, is to play devil's advocate. I don't know if they're necessarily wrong. It does kind of feel like this is a major thing in our society right now. Like it is driving a lot of our discourse. It is driving a lot of our activism. It is driving a lot of how you get young people involved in politics right now, whether you're on the left or the right. And I think that there might actually be some truth to the idea of this prisoner's dilemma where each party, the Democratic and Republican Party, feels like if they don't go 150 miles per hour on this issue, the other party takes it. And then, to the winner goes the spoils. It's a bad system. It's created bad incentives, but I just struggle so much with what the solution is, because I would tend to agree with somebody who says that we're in the prisoner's dilemma, that whichever party is sleeping on this issue or even just trying to maybe not sleep on it, but take it a little more slowly, is going to get bulldozed, because we're in a society that is drawn to the kind of hyper over-the-top rhetoric and activism, unfortunately, that you're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're probably onto something there. I don't know what the solution is. I think it's really helpful when trans clinicians talk about this stuff. People like Erica Anderson. I don't think it's helpful when activists or groups like the ACLU come out with these sort of platitudes. Trans women are women, trans kids are whatever. Just repeat these slogans as though they're somehow meaningful. This issue is much more complex, and it's really unfortunate that this is impacting people's real lives. Kids really have become political fodder. They're being pushed in one direction or the other, and they're being used. They're being used by politicians and activists.
Yeah, the politicians and activists definitely. They have not been much of an inspiration. The other group that I really wanted to ask you about in terms of your perspective, because they're an important part of this story, is the media, the large media outlets who are covering the story. I mean, you yourself are a journalist. I'll go out on a limb and say I think you're a very good journalist who actually does good fact-based reporting on these issues. It is funny because I think about the report you did on detransitioners that kind of made you controversial in some ways, and I think it's essential reporting. And I was glad to see that I think 60 Minutes recently did a little bit of something about detransitioners, and that was good. But my question to you, Katie, is as a journalist, as a good journalist, what you think about the way that most major media outlets have been covering these stories and these issues. How would you grade them, maybe F to A?
Oh, they fail. Yeah. They fail.
I'm not surprised.
Yeah. I think British outlets have done marginally better because this conversation is, for various reasons, this conversation is in some ways much more, basically there's a proposed act that would make gender self-identification, and so this was like big news in the UK for a couple of years, and so this was something that was really being debated within the pages of major magazines. In the US, there's one acceptable narrative, and I think this is changing a little bit. The vibe is shifting slightly, but for the most part, over the last, let's say, 5 years or so, 7 years maybe, there's been one acceptable narrative, and that narrative is, trans women are women, although it has changed to mean that to be almost literal in that sense. And anybody who questions that is a TERF or a transphobe or a bigot or whatever, and that's really been what's reflected in the pages of most major outlets in the U.S. Obviously, the right, the conservative press is entirely different, but in the left and mainstream press, there's one acceptable narrative.
Yeah, it definitely, there's, I don't even know when to pinpoint the exact time. It was around like 2014, 15. It just seems like the media became much more interested in these issues. Maybe it was around the time that like Caitlyn Jenner kind of, became a thing and came out. And I agree with you 100%. There really is only one way, it seems, that they'll talk about these issues. I mean, I guess I will say that I mentioned before the 60 Minutes report about detransitioners. Every once in a while, you see something sneak in there that could actually give people a different perspective. And unfortunately, it's like shocking to me. I'm like, wow, they're actually doing like, I know it's kind of become a meme on the right, but I do believe in this thing of like an act of journalism in the wild is unfortunately all too rare. I'm curious, one aspect of this that doesn't get talked about a lot that, it came up first for me when I was in college because I was a political science and mass comm double major, and I remember getting taught about how the AP style book when I was in school had just changed their rules so that you always use preferred pronouns in articles 100% of the time under any circumstances. I'm curious what you think about that in particular, because I feel like most people see that as kind of a harmless thing, but when I think about it, I do think in a way it does force journalistic institutions to kind of use their standard practices to take somewhat of a position on what is biological sex, when do you use these preferred pronouns. That was something that I think went under the radar. I'm curious if you have any thoughts about that as a journalist.
I think it is a solid best practice, and I totally understand the arguments against it, but for me, it's not just a matter of politeness, although I do think it's polite to refer to people as they prefer to be called. But it's also tactically, the moment you start, misgendering somebody, you have lost. Because that is the act, according to, contemporary standards, that is the act of a bigot. And once you draw that line in the sand and you cross it, your argument will not be taken seriously, because you have committed this sin. So tactically, I think it's very unwise for activists to not use people's preferred pronouns. And I think there's a lot of inconsistency here. You have someone like Graham Linehan, who's very prominent British commentator, who has seemingly destroyed his life over this issue, he is extremely online. And Graham, who misgenders women all the time, trans women all the time, wouldn't misgender Buck Angel because they're friends, and Buck, and Buck agrees with him on some issues, right? So I think there needs to be consistency here too. And for me, it's just like, I'm going to be consistent about it. I think that there's a difference between public speech and private speech as well. I understand why people bristle, because to them it's conceding something when you use someone's preferred pronouns. But I just think tactically it's really an error not to. And I get it. In some cases, it feels crazy to have to use someone's preferred pronoun if there's a big bearded dude who has done absolutely nothing to change her physical appearance, and you have to call this person her. I understand that. It feels weird and an Orwellian. I get that. But for me, it's just like, I have decided for myself, I will not misgender people in public conversation. Private conversation is totally different. Do whatever the fuck you want. But just because I think that tactically it is why would you give somebody ammunition for something like this? So I understand why people refuse to do it, but I just don't think it's a smart tactic.
It seems to me like maybe it's kind of a damned if you do, damned if you don't kind of thing, which is unfortunately I think the story of pretty much everything.
I get yelled at for using people's preferred pronouns all the time, right? And if I didn't use people's preferred pronouns, I'd get yelled at even more, just by different people. So you can refer to people exclusively by their names, I suppose. That gets sort of awkward in conversation, but just avoid pronouns entirely. I also find it sort of ironic that there's this tendency among some on the left to default to they. If someone doesn't explicitly say my pronouns are he, she, or whatever, then the default is they. That is misgendering. If you call me they, you are misgendering me. And even if you're doing it because you think that this should be the default neutral and you don't want to assume my pronouns, assume my pronouns. Just assume that they're fucking she. And so I find that really bizarre as well. There's so many inconsistencies in this latest version of queer ideology.
Yeah, this is like a seemingly impossible issue to solve. I mean, I think about it as maybe, one compromise is that you could say when it's relevant in a story. I mean, let's say there's a story about Leah Thomas. Maybe somebody wants to use the she pronouns, but you have to put who is biologically male. And that is absolutely factual information. But I don't think you really can do that right now. I think that even that is too much.
Yeah, I mean, so the shorthand is you just say trans woman. What gets me is when there'll be some article about somebody who has, say, murdered people, and it's very clearly the mugshot or whatever, the photo and the image is very clearly male, and the outlet doesn't acknowledge this person's biological sex or doesn't acknowledge that this person is trans. That to me is like, do you think we're stupid? Let's not pretend that the fucking serial rapist is a female.
Well, but I mean, would that be somewhat of an exception to the preferred pronouns rule? Because that's kind of the thing.
I don't think that you can have exceptions. I think that you have to for me at least, there are no exceptions. In public speak, there are no exceptions.
So, but I mean, in terms of the example you gave about like a somebody who appears to pretty much anyone to be male and their picture is included in a story and who has committed like a violent crime, which of course men commit the vast majority of violent crimes, and that's what you kind of expect when you're reading about violent crime. I mean, were you saying, I might have misheard you, were you saying that that's a situation where you find it particularly awkward, or that you think that they shouldn't use the female pronoun, or were you just saying that they should acknowledge in some way that this is a biologically male person?
I think they just need to acknowledge that. But if you like, what is the line, right? If you say I'm only like I'm going to use the correct gender, the preferred gender for everybody except murderers. Like they're just I just like, what is the line? It's like if you're pretty enough, if you can pass, then I'll use your preferred pronoun, but I won't if you can't. If you're super annoying, I won't use your preferred pronoun, but if I like you, I will. So I think that because like I just try to be consistent as possible, and because I just don't know what that demarcation would be. At what point, if you grow a B cup, am I going to not misgender you? But if you have an A cup, I will. So just in an effort to be consistent, I will, in public conversation, always use the correct or the preferred pronoun. But that doesn't change the fact that I can use someone's preferred pronoun and still acknowledge that they are biologically male.
Yeah. It like I was saying, I think the whole damned if you do, damned if you don't thing is that on one hand, you will be perceived as bigoted, and it's hard not to come off as mean-spirited. Like, even if somebody wouldn't go so far is to see you as being bigoted, even people who might agree with somebody on a lot of these issues about things going too far with certain trans activism, it's hard not to see someone as at least acting in a cruel or mean way if they do misgender someone. But at the same time, and this is the argument that you'll hear from more conservative people, this is the argument that Ben Shapiro has posited on numerous occasions, you do kind of give something up tactically by using preferred pronouns. I mean, if you are making I think the position I'm sort of speaking about here is probably further to the right than your position is on this issue. But if you're really making an argument that there shouldn't be any breakdown at all of sort of sex and gender, if you're coming from a little bit more of a conservative position, you can't give up the tactical ground that you give up when you do use the preferred pronoun. So I don't envy our society and the task we've been given when it comes to the preferred pronoun thing. I'm personally torn on it. I don't really have a policy on it, to be honest. I mean, I think when I did my interview with Buck Angel, who I think he's a lovely person. Right there, I said he. There's just something about speaking to Buck that I feel like I'm looking at a man, and that my
Yeah.
brain goes, my brain defaults to man, because I've been using pronouns
yeah.
for 27 years, and I just go with the default. But there is something about, if I was doing an interview with Leah Thomas, that might not be
Right.
my default to go she. There's
For sure.
we're trying to rewire ourselves, and it's like,
Right. It comes down to aesthetics. Buck passes better than Leah does.
Yeah.
But then again, there's someone like, you have Janet Mock, who absolutely passes as female, a biological male who absolutely passes as female. And so at some point it comes down to sort of aesthetics, and access, and how well you conform to the stereotype of what it is to be a woman or what it is to be a man. And that feels sort of unfair too. So I'm gonna correctly gender the pretty person, but not the ugly person.
Yeah.
That feels kind of fucked up. The person who does have access to facial feminization surgery, I will respect that person, but the person who doesn't, it is really hard to be consistent on these issues. And again, I do think there's a very big difference between public conversation and private conversation. And if you want to call Leah Thomas he to your friends or whatever, go for it. But for activists, and I'm not actually an activist on this issue or any issue, but for activists, if you want to pull people to your side, if you want to convince people, I think you need to do it in a way that isn't, you don't need more conservatives on your side. What you need is liberals, moderate liberals, who can acknowledge biological reality, but also believe in human rights. And I think if you misgender people, you lose those people.
Yeah, I think there's kind of a dearth of people in the category of like striking the right balance between just seeming empathetic on the issue and seeming like they really want to acknowledge some kind of human experience. That's a quote from Dave Chappelle's most recent special. He talked about his conversation with his friend, who unfortunately was a trans woman. I think she died, but and how this person had asked him to acknowledge her just kind of human experience. I think, and Dave Chappelle might be one of the only people who, in my opinion, has maybe struck the balance on this issue in terms of showing his humanity and his empathy on this issue, and at the same time saying that he's a comedian and his job is to make fun of things that are funny, and there are funny things about this issue. He's one of very few examples, I think, of the people. I feel like we're kind of, there's a dearth of people who can improve the discourse on this issue. It does seem to be just so toxic to the point where, because I don't know, there's nothing I'd like more than to see a conversation between like a Ben Shapiro and a Laverne Cox or whoever, that is like a good conversation. I mean, the most famous interaction between Ben Shapiro and a trans person is the trans person saying they want to beat him up. It's like, unfortunately, that's what we get.
Yeah, I mean, I thought the Chappelle special was really good, but obviously it was horribly received by activists and by the media, although viewers seem to like it quite a bit. And this is, I mean, he's right. This is funny. Like, the civil rights issue of our day is, 50-year-old divorced fathers who want to be called Brenda and use the women's room. It's funny. It is. And, and that's another thing, is that identity has become so sacrosanct that we're not supposed to question it. We're not supposed to laugh about it. We're not supposed to make jokes about it. This shit's funny. We have a bunch of what are really probably heterosexual, adolescents and young people who have decided that they are non-binary. We're supposed to, and we have to respect that, and we have to, okay. I'm inconsistent. I will admit to some inconsistency as well, because I fucking hate the pronoun they. It is confusing. I will use it when I sort of have to, but it is confusing. It makes it hard to understand what is going on in some circumstances. And I think a lot of people who use it are just as binary as everybody else. They're just trying to be special. So that is the one that I bristle at. I don't have a problem calling people he or she if they like it. I do not like the pronoun they. Z would have been a better option, but for some reason that one never took off.
For some reason, Z did not take off. I can't imagine. But, I mean, you also get, now there's queer, which I don't even know what it means, really. Like, people are just saying that they're queer. I don't think it means that. Yeah, am I right? Like, that was my interpretation, was this basically means nothing.
It's a social and political identity. It says absolutely nothing about one's sexual orientation. I find that word extremely aggravating, because the entire point of identifying as it's supposed to be about identifying your sexual orientation, and all that tells me is that you would never vote for Trump. It's just it's a political designation.
Yeah,
It's stupid.
it seems to be for people who kind of want a piece of the LGBT plus pie, and they can't get one because they don't want to be trans or whatever. And it's like, it does. I think it's a good example though of the fact that the incentives on these issues are so bad. I mean, there is a lot of sort of social capital that you can get in certain places. It's funny because it depends on where you are. Like if you're at some small business in the middle of Texas, you probably don't but if you're in a lot of like newsrooms or writers' rooms in Hollywood or certainly most college campuses, there's a lot of social capital to be gained by being included in this sort of LGBTQIA plus, I actually don't even know all the letters anymore, umbrella. I lost track at some point, but so queer, I have sort of interpreted it as like, these are people who kind of want a piece of that pie and they're going to just use the easiest one to get their piece.
Yeah, I mean, it's about being special. It's about not being perceived as heteronormative. It's just about, it's this irony where people like, difference is cool, but you're not being different. You're just being like everybody else who self-identifies as queer. And this is just a moment that we're in. I mean, I don't think that this is going to be some sort of permanent change where people are going to stop identifying as heterosexual because it's not cool. I think we're just in a moment. And this will pass. I just don't know when. Hopefully sooner rather than later.
I hope you're right. I wonder about that. That's a question I ask myself all the time is if and when this particular thing will end, because my personal timeline for this has been very bizarre. I graduated from high school in 2013, graduated from college 2017. So I had like a weird experience where in high school this didn't exist. And then while I was in college, which is the worst place to be while this stuff is going on, and I also was in the College Democrats. I was the president of the College Democrats. So I watched my group of sort of like young political activists go from like very focused on like interventions in Syria and like the minimum wage to this stuff that I was like, what is happening? And I've really just been wanting it to stop. And that's why every time this comes up on my show, I'm always like, any ideas? Like I ask everybody, it's a hard question to answer. Like you said earlier, I ask everybody, that's just something I try to do in general on this show is see if there are any solutions to the problems we're discussing. And as you said earlier, and I would definitely concede this, it's certainly not obvious what the hell we do. I'm always glad to hear optimism, though. It's just nice to hear somebody say that it sounds like you think this is something that will pass. I mean, do you think it could have something to do with what I hear a lot about, Katie, is the idea that there's going to be actual lawsuits that come out, particularly for young people who were medically transitioned way, way, way too quickly. Do you think that does seem like maybe the brick wall that this thing might hit?
I think that's a huge part of it. Unfortunately, there have been a number of people have attempted to sue their doctors, and it depends on what state you're in. In some places, medical malpractice it's really hard to file suit. And there are caps on things like the amount of money you can get in certain places. I do think that's part of it, though. I think when it starts costing institutions, when insurers start having to pay out more, when doctors are losing their medical licenses, then things will shift. And we're already seeing shifts in the UK and in other parts of Europe. They are changing the rules around things like puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones for youth because they have seen that the outcomes are not positive enough to outweigh the negative outcomes. But obviously, this is a different country and
well, and is this particular issue something that needs to be? This is kind of a logistical question because I actually don't know. I should know because my dad works in medicine, but I don't know. Is this something that is governed by the medical industry itself, or actually does the government have to step in to change kind of the medical malpractice laws? It's probably a little bit of both, I'm guessing.
I'm not sure how medical malpractice laws work.
Yeah, I'm just curious from a perspective.
Yeah, I mean, and if reporters weren't afraid and outlets weren't afraid to run stories about people like detransitioners, then then it wouldn't be such a sort of unknown population.
Yeah, that's such an important story that needs to be told. It's unfortunate that these young people are seen as, I mean, they're called like, transphobe aligned, like sympathizers or whatever. It's like, there's a lot of these people. I mean, I think like the Reddit group, which certainly isn't representative of everyone who's had this experience, but even that group is like, what is it, like 30,000 people? Like, and it seems like they're popping up all over the place. Abigail Shrier did her book particularly about like young women who are the speed at which it's been happening seems unnatural. Also, like the fact that even this conversation can get us in so much trouble drives me nuts.
Well, I mean, I think it actually is natural because humans are a mimetic species. And when I was in high school in the 90s, half the girls in my school were anorexic or bulimic or cutters. There's something very natural about fads and about how ideas spread throughout culture. And the internet obviously ramps that up and makes sort of super spreader events. What I find problematic, though, is that so this concept, rapid onset gender dysphoria, as Lisa Littman coined it, there are institutions and there are people within institutions who are devoted to discrediting this idea that this thing exists. When go to any fucking high school and ask how many trans kids there are. I mean, obviously it would depend a bit on where you are. Portland is probably going to have a lot more trans kids than Houston, but this is something that is happening. The data bears it out when you look at referrals to gender clinics, but also just anecdotal evidence here. Just go talk to some kids. Ask how many people go by they, them in their schools. And there are people who are just absolutely devoted to claiming that this is a myth.
Yeah, well, and I think that the sensitivity here is that you've got a group of activists who really, really do not want this idea. The idea that it could be a trend or something that is mimetic is extremely damaging to a lot of the gender ideology. Because nobody wants their ideology to be reduced to a trend. That's obviously extremely
or
damaging.
Their identity. Identity is incredibly sacrosanct right now. It's something that we're all supposed to give a shit about. I don't think I have a gender identity. I think I have a sex and no gender identity at all. But we sort of, in some circles, this has just become accepted. We all have a gender identity as though it's some organ inside of us, like the soul or something. Well, I don't have one.
Yeah. Well, it's another thing that nobody, I don't know if this was your experience. In my experience, gender and sex were used interchangeably until like the year 2014. Like that was not, yes. I didn't know what gender identity was. Nobody ever asked me my pronouns. I mean, it's extremely new. There's one thing I definitely wanted to ask you about in the time that we have that is kind of connected to this. And it's that you were discussing in a couple other interviews I listened to that you had done how you yourself are a lesbian and you have other lesbians in your social circles, and you've noticed that there seems to be kind of like a weird lesbian extinction event going on where there's an inverse relationship between non-binary and trans people, especially trans men, and the number of lesbians, which I found kind of bizarre, and it's something that I know nothing about because I don't happen to know a ton of lesbians. What has that experience been like? Can you elaborate on that a little bit? Because that really kind of caught my ear.
It's very weird. So my first inkling that something was happening. I've known trans people. I've been in queer circles for the last 20 years, so I've always known trans people. There was always sort of a handful of them within any given community, mostly trans guys. But in maybe 2013, 2014. I moved to Charlotte, North Carolina, and one of my best friends there was a trans guy, and he told me he had lived in a small town before this, and he lived in a household with 5 lesbians, and he came out as trans, and then within a year the entire household could come out. And when he told me this, I was like, that is statistically just the likelihood of that is just such an impossibility. I thought something's going on here, and then now, however many years later, 8 years later, whatever. It's everyone. It's everyone, and I'm slightly exaggerating here, but just in the circles that I'm no longer really welcome in these circles, but in the circles that I used to be in, my friend groups, the number of people who have gone by, who now call themselves non-binary or who are physically transitioned is astronomical. I need to keep a spreadsheet. It seems like every month somebody else is coming out and posting pictures of their new trans mustache or whatever. It is everywhere, and this isn't just in cities like New York or Seattle. This is happening in small towns as well. It's very bizarre. And the thing to me that I find most bizarre about it is that so few people are talking about it and saying, wait a second, guys, Like 2 years ago, we were all women, and now we're all men. What the fuck happened? We're just supposed to sort of clap and pat people on the back and say, congratulations, you're so brave, rather than saying, what the fuck is going on? Because something is going on.
Yeah, and I would imagine that it's been kind of transformative for a community that was like sort of making big gains in like acceptability in the early 2010s, just the gay and lesbian community. And then now it seems like gays and lesbians are like, I don't know if to just go like classical gays and lesbians, they're like going extinct. It is, I have noticed there does seem to have been a huge drop off, whether it's people I know personally or people that I'm just sort of seeing out in the world, seeing out in public, that just people being gay, it just seems to be less of a thing. And it's particularly fascinating in the context of sort of 2011 and 2012 being such banner years for the gay community, just with the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, Barack Obama supporting same-sex marriage, which kind of precipitated the legalization of same-sex marriage nationwide. There was no like buffer period. There really wasn't at all. It kind of just went from like, we're having a conversation about gay marriage is legal, next. And there was not even there wasn't like a month of just like, that we're going to sort of maybe continue to have the conversation about a rapid change. You know, we've been talking about kind of like trans stuff and gender ideology, but there was also a pretty rapid change in the way people view homosexuality in general in the 2000s. Yeah. And that conversation immediately just disappeared.
Yeah, and I think we're seeing backlash right now to the speed at which things have changed. You know, and you can see this in polling, you know, and then also a lot of the sort of the rhetoric around sexuality is coming from the right is actually deeply homophobic. They use the term fucking grooming the way that the left uses the term white supremacy. Everything isn't actually grooming, but there is this like, I think that is deeply homophobic, this idea that, you know, teachers are trying to like groom kids into some sort of like pedophilia. So I think we've seen more backlash in just the last year than you know the last 10 years before that. Yeah,
I mean my hope is that cooler heads will prevail, and I think that I would definitely call you a cooler head, Katie, and it's been a pleasure talking to you. But I know that you had about an hour, and we're at about an hour. I do want to ask, though, before we sign off, if there's anything you want to promote. I will recommend your podcast, Blocked and Reported, and I feel free to promote it as well yourself. It might mean more coming directly from you. But, you know, what do you want to talk about? Where can people find you? Anything you want to talk about, promote before we sign off?
Yeah, the show is at blockedandreported.org. It's on all major podcast platforms as well. But if you go to blockedandreported.org, we have a subscription program there that for $5 a month you can get 3 extra episodes of our show every month. So it's a pretty good deal. And there's a good community over there. Lots of interesting people, and the comment sections on our shows are always very interesting. So check it out.
All right, people, be sure to check that stuff out. And thank you so much for listening to the Veritas podcast. You know what I want you to do? That's a 5-star review if you're on iTunes. I want you to like, comment, and subscribe if you're watching on YouTube. And I will see you guys next time on the Veritas podcast.